Good evening, everyone. Today we're exploring the fascinating world of memory and how multimedia impacts learning. Our journey will include an overview of memory processes, understanding sensory, short term, and long term memory, and practical examples for creating lasting memories in the minds of our students. Our agenda today is to go through memory overview, the types of memory, look at the shelves analogy, how multimedia impacts memory, practical examples, some insights from chapter 4, some implications for practice for educators, and our conclusion. So let's start by understanding the basics. Memory involves encoding, storing, and retrieving information. Uh, Julie Dirksen in chapter 4 emphasizes sensory memory, short term memory, and long term memory as fundamental components of our memory system. So each type of memory that we have, it starts with sensory memory. We receive an impulse from our senses, whether we see, taste, smell, hear, feel something with touch, we will receive an impulse with our senses. So our sensory memory captures the richness of external input, including temperature or sounds, color, smell, taste. And then now let's explore how information progresses from those temporary shelves of short term memory to the more permanent shelves of long term memory. In chapter 4,
Read it.
all right, just in chapter 4, the author Julie Dirksen introduces a analogy called the shelves analogy, and it helps us to understand how our brain kind of organizes new information as it's coming in. So first, it's from a sense. We're going to see, hear, touch, feel, smell something, and automatically that information will get put on a temporary shelf. And the analogy with the shelves is it's the more shelves we can connect together, the higher chance we have at remembering that information. So in chapter 4, Dirksen does use an example of remembering a German word for mustache, and I won't even try to pronounce what that term is in German, but we could involve shelves learn that could possibly be labeled like the German word mustache or words that sound like sneezes, and linking all of those shelves together helps someone to remember how to actually say that German term. But I wanted to put that, since I'm a science teacher, I wanted to put that into science terms. So I have to get my students to understand DNA base pairs. They have to know adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. So all of those are really sciencey words. But on top of that, they also have to understand which ones are purines and pyrimidines, and how many hydrogen bonds are holding those base pairs together. So we already have a shelf that has a lot of science words connected to it. But we use a lot of mnemonics and different sayings to help them link these base pairs together. So pure as gold helps us to remember that adenine and guanine, because the A from as and G from gold, adenine and guanine are purines. That's why they're pure. And cytosine and thymine are pyrimidines. That's why we say cut the pie, pyrimidines, C and T, cytosine and thymine. So that helps them to link those base pairs to pyrimidines and purines. Then they have to know what the base pairs are. So adenine always pairs with thymine, or apples in the tree. Cytosine always pairs with guanine, so cars in the garage. And then how many hydrogen bonds are between them? And so there are 2 hydrogen bonds between thymine and adenine. So we say 2 tall apes and 3 cute giraffes, because there are 3 hydrogen bonds between cytosine and guanine. So we're trying to get as many different shelves connecting all of these base pairs and new vocabulary for our students, so that they have a higher chance of knowing it and remembering it. So to sum up the shelves analogy, or this metaphor, it helps us understand how information is temporarily held in short-term memory before it gets organized and we rehearse it and transferred into our long-term storage. The prefrontal cortex manages our short-term memory, while the hippocampus and distributed brain regions control our long-term memory. So the more shelves we have and the better organized they are, the more likely we are to remember and to retrieve information effectively. So some insights from chapter 4 along with that shelves analogy. In addition to the sensory, the short-term, and the long-term memory, Dirksen introduces in context learning, and she emphasizes that the best place to learn a subject is in the environment of that subject. For example, understanding manufacturing is best achieved by visiting manufacturing facilities and factories instead of sitting in a classroom with dull walls all around them. The same thing is how doctors are trained on how to provide a patient with terrible, terrible bad news. They can't possibly read in a textbook how to tell a family or a patient that they have cancer or that their loved one has died. The best way to be able to learn how to actually do that is in context. So, for a lot of schooling for doctors of all different fields, or of all different specialties, they will have people in the doctor's offices, and they have to go in and practice telling that person bad news, and they're actors and actresses who have a script to play by. So that actor or actress might be told to break down emotionally crying, or to get angry, or to completely shut down. And so that puts all of the training doctors on their toes and on their feet, so they actually have to experience all of those emotions that they would have in context, because you cannot learn that by textbook. So that is one thing that Dirksen says is very, very important for our students. So whatever we are wanting them to learn, they need to feel the stress that might come with actually having to incorporate that in the real world. They have to have the emotions behind it. They need to be in the same setting. And that is really, really hard, just to think we have to keep our kids in a school classroom, but we have media at our fingertips, and we can constantly go to a lot of different sources and apps and simulations to help incorporate that with our students in our schools. Dirksen also highlighted a lot of different types of memory on top of just the normal short term or sensory short term and long term. So she did discuss declarative or semantic memory, which is memorizing facts and principles and ideas. And a lot of the times, that's what our students are doing in our classrooms. There is episodic memory, which helps with stories that make information more memorable. In chapter 4, there's a lot of examples of how putting something in a story and telling a story about that information helps students to remember it so much easier than just reading a list of facts. So if we can introduce this information to our children using a story, that automatically helps push that learning curve from our short-term memory, and we'll push it into possibly a long-term memory for our students just by putting it into a story. Conditional memory is ingrained in our genes and evolution, just like our fight or flight instincts. It's what we're kind of exposed to and conditioned to throughout our life. Procedural memory is used to perform procedures like driving. This is developed over time. So the way that we know how to read, how do we know how to do a cartwheel? So they are procedures. They're like steps that we learn over time. And then we do have flashbulb memory as well, and it's a vivid recall of emotionally like targeted or charged events, just like we all will probably remember exactly where we were and what we were doing at the time that we found out of 9/11. That would be flashbulb memory. So building our understanding of memory, Julie, Dirksen's chapter 4 emphasizes crucial role memory plays in learning. So she does discuss the sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. The sensory memory captures external input, while short-term memory involves planning and forgetting quickly. Long-term memory, however, involves making multiple connections to a subject, like creating multiple shelves for a particular topic. Dirksen also introduces the concept of shelves that we discussed to illustrate how multiple connections contribute to long-term memory. Each connection has its own shelf, and the more connections that we can make, the more likely we are to remember them. And she emphasizes the importance of in-context learning and introduces various types of these memories all throughout chapter 4. So now, how does multimedia impact memory? As we're moving on to how multimedia impacts memory, we're going to discuss dual coding theory, which emphasizes the importance of presenting information verbally and visually. We'll also explore how multimedia helps capture and sustain attention, and the concept of spatial continuity, which integrates visual and verbal elements for better comprehension. And these are things that we can put directly into use in our classrooms right now. Now let's explore the first practical example, dual coding. This involves incorporating visuals like diagrams or infographics alongside verbal explanations. The goal is to engage both visual and verbal memory systems, which will facilitate better encoding and retrieval of that information. So instead of your students just making flashcards with only words on there, we need to also provide diagrams or a visual along with verbal instructions or them saying each of those terms. One way that I do this in my classroom is I like to do a lot of puzzles or matching, and it may have a vocabulary term, but it will have an image along with that vocabulary term that will help them make connections to the definition for that vocabulary term. I get that that's easy for some classes and not as easy as others, like history, but maybe whatever you are specializing in, you are able to think of different diagrams or infographics or pictures or whatever to put along with your verbal explanations or new words or new terms that you're trying to get your students to learn. Next, our second example focuses on interactive quizzes or possibly games. Doesn't always have to be a quiz. So these activities provide retrieval practice, actively engaging students in recalling information. The more they recall on that shelf for that or that topic for that shelf, the more likely they are to put that and store it into a long-term memory. So not only does this strengthen memory, but also makes learning more enjoyable and dynamic. A good, quick, easy way to do this in your classroom is to use Quizlet, Quizlet Labs, Quiz. There's so many more that you could use. We do Google Forms a lot. You can use QR codes and make it a scavenger hunt. So you're just pulling multimedia in for your instruction and what you would already have your students to do, but you're making it a game or you're quizzing them. And that's helping to have active engagement, which will help reinforce learning. Lastly, if since I teach science, this is really easy for me, but I love to do virtual labs. If we don't have the supplies to do it in person, virtual labs help to offer a hands-on experience, but it also promotes active learning. So our students are enhancing understanding and memory through real-world application. Um, it can also be different simulations. It doesn't have to necessarily be a lab, but all of the things that we do for science is either like in person in the lab, or we do use our Chromebooks in our classrooms. So different simulations like a skate park, and we're measuring the mass of a skater and the acceleration and the speed and all of those things and directions to help us calculate a lot of different physics formulas. It could be that we are going through paper chromatography for plant pigments and we're extracting those pigments out just to see it on the screen and actually have to pick up their instruments that they would use and your lab equipment. That's just engaging for the students, and it could possibly help them remember that information a lot easier by implementing just some media. As we come to a close in our conclusion, let's summarize our key points. So, memory involves storing, it first involves encoding and then storing and retrieving information. And we've explored the impact of dual coding, attention, and interactivity on memory. Now, let's discuss the implications of these insights for your teaching practice. So, as educators, we need to recognize the richness of connections in long term memory and the varied types of memory that can guide our teaching strategies. If we encourage students to create multiple connections, if we can use storytelling, and if we can engage in experimental learning, it could enhance our students' memory retention. So, if you use Canva, having students, even if you create it, having a visual as students are seeing it is making those dual connections. If they then have to do something and do drag and drop activities, that is reading, that might be hearing, and that is doing. So we're connecting those things. I talked about the Quizlet and the quiz is, but also the biology corner and the physicsclassroom.com are different places that you can find virtual labs and simulations if you're a science teacher. So those are examples of how we can implement these things in our classrooms right now. But we can also consider helping to personalize the content to meet our individual learning preferences. Just like all of our resources had a like the end in mind goal, and we start with the very end. What do we want our students to be able to do? And then we build our content from that instead of beginning to end. Let's start at the end and go to the beginning with our planning of all of our lessons. So we can personalize content to meet the individual learning preferences. We can introduce novelty and variety to keep students engaged. We don't want it to be the same thing over and over and over and over, because too much repetition is a bad thing, but not enough repetition is also a bad thing. So we do have to find a happy medium, but just to keep some variety to keep students engaged. And we need to utilize digital platforms for continuous review and repetition. It is proven that the more students pull on that information, pull on and review and rehearse and repeat using the information that we're trying to give them, the more likely they are to store it to their long term memory, which is how we can use multimedia to impact learning for our students. Thank you.